I want to be clear from the start. By containment, I don't mean containment of the Islamic State, which is how some people have interpreted this approach, but really containment of the instability in Syria. A while ago, Ken and I did some research on these massive civil wars, ones like what we're seeing now in Syria, and we found one of the biggest problems is that they often spill over into neighboring states. So not only does this spread a tremendous humanitarian tragedy even further, but it leads to the spread of terrorist groups or the creation of new ones. It leads to instability in neighboring countries, and it leads to intervention and war that gets more massive. And this should be pretty obvious because we've already seen it in Syria, right? The Syrian Civil War began in 2011, and several years later, we see Iraq in a massive civil war as well. And there's a lot that went into the Iraqi Civil War. I don't want to say it was all Syria, but it's hard to tell the story of the renewal of civil war in Iraq without including the story of Syria. And so the question to me is, are there ways to look at this conflict and prevent it from spreading further? So further into Iraq, but also to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Turkey, on and on and on, to the region in general. Are there ways to stop harmful interventions that make the conflict worse or spread elsewhere? I think the Saudi intervention in Yemen, for example, is in some ways linked to the conflict in Iraq and Syria, and Saudi Arabia's view of the world that emanates from that. And so when we think about containment, what might that mean? One of the first things are the refugees. This has gotten a lot of play, but by refugees, I primarily don't mean refugees in Europe or the several thousand being considered to the United States. I mean the millions who are in neighboring states. And there's tremendous potential for destabilization. One of the best historical analogs is the Palestinian refugee problem, where after the 47-48 War of Israeli Independence, we saw massive Palestinian refugee flows. And over time, this grew in very odd and perhaps unanticipated ways, but ways that spread civil war, that spread radicalization. And the Syrian refugees are not going home in the near term, right? It's not as if anyone, I think, in this room thinks, oh, in 1 year, 3 years, or even 5 years, these people are going back home. So we're having a generation of refugees raised outside their homes, yet not integrated into their new homes. And to me, that is, first of all, horrible in the humanitarian sense, which I think should matter to us. But beyond that, it's a recipe for instability and disaster. These are young people ripe for recruitment for radical groups. We see again and again that the refugee camps themselves become bases for fighters. So if you want to contain the violence, you start by caring for refugees. And caring for doesn't just mean clothing and feeding, it also means policing. It means preventing the refugee camps from becoming armed camp for militant groups. Ideally, it means moving refugee camps away from borders. It means breaking them down so they're smaller and not these kind of concentrations of instability. And ideally, integrating refugees into their host societies. And so it's a significant humanitarian effort that also has strategic consequences. Also, you care about border security. You want to stop militants from going back and forth across borders, and you want to try to seal this up. This is exceptionally difficult, of course, but you can limit the problem. You can reduce it by more effective border security. So whether it's Jordan, whether it's Lebanon, there are places where you can change this, and we've seen this recently in Turkey, where Turkey had basically a very laissez-faire attitude towards fighters going into Syria in particular. And I don't want to say it's perfect now, but there's been quite a dramatic shift in recent months. Also, you want to give counterterrorism assistance. You want to make sure that the neighboring states are able to fight terrorism on their own soil, and in general have competent intelligence services and competent security services in general. And more broadly, this extends to the military. I would not expect the Jordanian military to collapse on contact with Islamic State fighters, but you want to make sure that neighboring states are able to fight effectively when pressed, that if the Islamic State does try to expand further, that it's pushed back not only by U.S. air power, but by effective neighboring state forces. And last is you also want to try to weaken the Islamic State. Now, I want to be careful here. If we're talking about containment, it's not talking about defeating the Islamic State. I would love that to happen, right? I would love to have a magic wand and have the Islamic State go away tomorrow. But realistically, what you're trying to do is use a combination of limited air power and limited training methods to try to prevent the Islamic State from getting bigger and ideally push it back, kill its leadership, weaken it. Hopefully, there'll be competent indigenous forces that arise that you can advance. But this is a limited effort measure. So I want to contrast it with what Ken is proposing, which has far more potential, but is also far more difficult and involves far more of an effort. A few last things to say about this option. It's hard, right? The dynamics we're talking about in civil wars are powerful, and they're difficult for outsiders to directly shape. I think you can move things around, but hard to directly shape. And at best, it's going to be incomplete results, right? This is not the sort of thing where you say, oh, Byman said take care of refugees, we'll do that, they're taken care of, right? You're going to have a lot of programs going on, some of which will be more effective than others. And I think very important to add, what I'm proposing doesn't completely solve the problem, right? You still have a massive civil war going on in Iraq and Syria, right? The idea is to staunch the bleeding and prevent it from getting worse. And ideally, by reducing some of the intervention and so on, you might be able to reduce the kind of heat of the fires. But this is not stopping the war continues. But the advantage of this compared with other options, which we can talk about more, is it's relatively low cost, right? When you're not talking about a massive military effort, when you're not talking about extensive US political involvement in the same degree, there still is cost, but it's not at the same level